Hey all, this is APGOV Buddy. Today we're talking about civil rights laws. So, when you get an FRQ and an APGOV exam, the readers don't just want general comments and general ideas from you, they want specific examples. So, if you have an FRQ that deals with civil rights, you're going to need to know some civil rights laws. So, let's take a look. If you know one law, you should know the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So after Brown v. Board of Education prohibited government segregation, we still had private businesses segregating or refusing services and employment to non-white customers. The provisions of this act, which by the way is signed by LBJ, you can see him there at the bottom, it prohibits discrimination in public accommodations such as restaurants and hotels. Title VII of that law prohibits employment discrimination based on race, religion, sex, and national origin. Voting Rights Act of 1965. So the 15th Amendment, of course, gave voting rights to African Americans, but we have states using things like literacy tests, grandfather clauses, etc., in order to restrict those rights. So LBJ is going to sign the Voting Rights Act to give African Americans full access to the ballot box. The provisions of the law, it outlaws methods that restrict voting rights. And it's going to require that some jurisdictions with a history of discrimination get pre-clearance from the federal government before changing voting laws. Fair Housing Act of 1965. So at this point, there is no legal segregation, but there is de facto segregation. We see people using things like redlining and restrictive covenants to keep white neighborhoods from being integrated. As you can see in the map on the right, we have a map drafted by the federal government used by banks to decide which areas should get their best home loans. Green areas were considered desirable and they would get generous loan terms. Red areas, hence redlining, were areas that were largely minority and working class, and they were considered risky by the banks, and they were given very poor terms on home loans with often very high interest. This is going to make home ownership very difficult for minorities. And as you should know, home ownership is one of the best ways for a family to build wealth throughout the generations. This is again signed by LBJ, and this is going to prohibit the use of these discriminatory loan practices and these restrictive covenants. Now, restrictive covenants were agreements that people had to sign when they bought a piece of property where they promised not to rent it or sell it to someone who is not white. Americans with Disabilities Act 1990. This is going to outlaw discrimination by businesses against people with disabilities. Signed by George H.W. Bush. It's going to require businesses to make reasonable accommodations, such as ramps and accessible restrooms for people with disabilities. Equal Pay Act of 1963. We've got a women's movement going on. Discrimination in the workplace is becoming publicized. So JFK is going to sign this into law, which says no employer shall discriminate between employees on the basis of sex for equal work. And last, we have Title IX. This is an amendment to existing law. It's aimed at tackling the problem of discrimination against women in college admissions and college programs. Signed by Richard Nixon. It prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex in any educational program that receives benefits from the federal government. As you can see on the chart on the right after 1972, we see a large increase in women's attendance at college. And to this day, women have far more opportunities in colleges, including athletic programs that continue to benefit them. Well, that's about it, guys. This is AP Gov Buddy. Crush that test.